Imagine being nearly 80 years old, dressed in royal robes, and standing in front of an army that isn't there to honor you. They're there to watch you break.
And then you hear the sentence. Not death. Not even execution.
3 days of torture first, and then something so brutal it would become legend. So what could possibly make an entire kingdom decide a queen didn't deserve a quick end? Because Queen Brunhild wasn't some helpless captive. For almost half a century, she played the most dangerous game in Frankish politics: crowns, bloodlines, betrayals, and revenge. She commanded nobles. She punished rivals. She treated kings like pieces on a board. And in a world ruled by men, that kind of power doesn't just create enemies, it creates obsession. By 613, the kingdom was cracking under civil war. And when Brunhild placed an 11-year-old boy, her grandson, on the throne, she thought she was saving the realm. But to the nobility, it looked like something else.
Not a coronation. A takeover.
Whispers spread fast, she's controlling everything. She's the reason kings keep dying. And then the accusation that sealed her fate. They claimed Brunhild was responsible for the deaths of 10 Frankish kings.
10.
It sounds unreal, like a villain's myth. But here's the terrifying part: in that era, you didn't need proof. You just needed a crowd ready to believe. Brunhild tried to escape with the young princes, racing toward safety, hoping distant allies would protect them. But Chlothar II's soldiers hunted them like wolves. And near a lake, the trap finally closed. The boys were taken. And Brunhild realized something in that moment that turned her blood cold. This wasn't a capture.
It was a performance.
And the trial waiting for her was designed to end only one way. They called it a trial, but everyone there already knew the ending. Brunhild was dragged into the camp like a trophy, an old woman exhausted, surrounded by men who suddenly felt brave because she was bound. And at the center of it all stood Chlothar II, the man who didn't just want her dead, he wanted her ruined. Because killing a queen is risky. But convincing the world she deserved it? That's how you erase a legacy. So the accusations came pouring out, fast, loud, dramatic, like a script being read to an audience that had already started cheering. They didn't list evidence.
They listed names. King after king. Death after death.
As if Brunhild was some single-handed curse on the Frankish throne. And here's the sick genius of it: some of those deaths happened in the same violent world where men murdered rivals constantly, and nobody blinked. But when the story was told about Brunhild, it became unnatural, monstrous, unforgivable. Not because the era was moral. Because the era was terrified of a woman who played their game better than they did. Now picture her standing there, nearly 80, while soldiers scream for blood.
No counsel. No defense. No chance.
Just a public condemnation designed to turn politics into justice. And when the sentence finally landed, it wasn't a simple execution order.
It was a schedule. 3 days.
3 days of punishment, carefully measured to keep her alive. Long enough for the army to feel satisfied, and for every noble watching to understand the message: this is what happens when you reach too far. Brunhild was led away not to die, but to begin disappearing, piece by piece, in front of the entire camp. And on the first day, they chose a method that wasn't only painful.
It was humiliating.
They brought out an animal the Franks barely saw up close, exotic, towering, awkward, and perfect for turning a queen into a spectacle.
A camel.
And when Brunhild saw what they were about to do with it, she finally understood: this wasn't torture to punish her body. It was torture to kill her dignity first. The moment they lifted Brunhild onto that camel, the execution stopped being private, and became theater. Not a clean death behind closed doors. Not even a fast humiliation. This was designed to travel, through gossip, through fear, through history. The camel swayed with every step, lurching like it wanted to throw her.
And that was the point.
The higher they placed her, the more visible she became. Every soldier could see her. Every soldier could join in.
And they did. Jeers. Spit. Screams.
Laughter that hit harder than fists. Men who once feared her orders now mocked her helplessness, because power is funny to people only when it's broken. But here's what most people miss: this wasn't just cruelty from an angry mob. It was strategy. Chlothar needed his army to stop seeing Brunhild as a queen.
Because if they saw a queen, they might feel pity. They might hesitate.
So he turned her into a villain in front of them. A living symbol of everything that went wrong.
A woman blamed for chaos. A woman blamed for men's wars.
A woman blamed for deaths that politics had already decided to forget, until her name became useful. And between those public parades, she was thrown back into confinement.
Cold nights. Bare shelter. Minimal food. Wounds left untreated.
Every hour designed to drain her, slowly, without letting her die. Because death would have been mercy. And mercy was not part of the plan. By the second day, her body would have been failing. Bones brittle with age.
Skin torn.
Muscles cramping from the constant jolting and restraints. Yet the torment had a rhythm: hurt her, humiliate her, let her survive, repeat. And somewhere in that suffering, you can almost feel the real purpose emerging. This wasn't just about Brunhild. It was about warning every noble family: do not challenge the new king. Do not back the wrong bloodline. Do not follow another strong regent ever again. But the darkest part? The final day wasn't going to end with the camel. Because Chlothar had saved one last method, an ending so violent that even chroniclers who lived in brutal times wrote about it with horror. On the third day, the whispers began moving through the camp like smoke. They're bringing the horse. And Brunhild, broken, exhausted, still alive, was forced to face the truth. The torture was the opening act. The real death was about to start. They didn't announce it like an execution. They staged it like a warning. At sunrise, Brunhild was pulled out in front of the assembled army one last time, so everyone could watch the justice happen with their own eyes.
And this time, there was no camel. No parade.
No slow humiliation.
Just a horse. Unbroken. Nervous. Powerful.
And then the bindings came out. Chroniclers later described her being fastened in a way meant to keep her attached no matter what, secured by her hair, and by limbs, to the animal's tail. It wasn't about killing her quickly. It was about letting the ground do the work, while the crowd looked on. Because once the horse bolted, and it would bolt, there was no controlling the outcome.
Someone shouted.
The horse snapped into motion. And instantly, Brunhild's body was yanked forward like she weighed nothing. The first jolt alone would have been unbearable. Then the speed turned everything into chaos. Rough earth, stones, roots, the entire camp blurring past as the animal panicked harder and harder. And the soldiers didn't stop it, because this was the point. Every few seconds, it got worse. Not because anyone added a new torture, but because momentum kept escalating, and the bindings held. This is what made it one of the most infamous royal deaths in early medieval Europe. It wasn't a blade.
It wasn't a single strike.
It was a method designed to erase a human being in motion, while thousands stood there and absorbed the message. And when the horse finally slowed, when the movement stopped, there was no queen left to negotiate with. No symbol left to rally around. But Chlothar still wasn't finished. Because even a corpse can become a political weapon. If people build a shrine, tell the story differently, or turn her into a martyr. So the final order wasn't about punishment. It was about deletion. They gathered what remained, and prepared the fire. And once you hear what they did next, what they made sure couldn't exist after that day, you'll understand this was never just an execution. It was an attempt to erase Brunhild from history itself. They didn't just want Brunhild dead. They wanted her unremembered. After the dragging, the camp fell into a strange kind of silence, the kind that happens when people realize they didn't just witness punishment, they witnessed something that can't be taken back. And that's when Chlothar's final move kicked in. Because in the Frankish world, a grave could become a spark. A burial site could turn into a gathering point. A story could flip fast into martyrdom. So they made sure there would be no tomb. Her remains were gathered and burned, reduced to ash, so there'd be nothing to honor, nothing to visit, nothing to rally around. It was politics all the way to the last ember. If you erase the body, you weaken the legend. And then Chlothar did what victors always do: he rewrote the meaning of what just happened. He presented Brunhild as the single source of decades of chaos.
Not civil war.
Not rival dynasties. Not the same brutal power plays every Frankish king used.
No, her. One woman. One villain.
One convenient answer. And here's what makes this story so unsettling: that narrative worked. Because the same acts, executions, betrayals, hard rule, were normal when men did them. But when Brunhild did them, chroniclers framed it as unnatural, wicked, almost scandalous just for existing. Her punishment wasn't only about what she'd done. It was about what she represented, a woman who held power in a world that hated seeing her hold it. After her death, the wars quieted. Chlothar's position strengthened. The Frankish kingdoms moved toward unification under one crown, built in part on the public destruction of a queen. So now ask yourself this: was Brunhild a ruthless political operator who finally got what was coming? Or was she a scapegoat, used to clean up a violent era by pinning it all on one name? Because there's one detail most retellings ignore, a detail that changes how you interpret her last days. What happened to the children taken with her? And once you hear that, the story stops being about one execution and becomes about the future they were trying to control. Here's the detail that makes Brunhild's ending feel less like justice and more like a calculated purge. When Clothair's men finally caught up to her near the lake, they didn't treat it like a normal surrender. There was no negotiation, no honorable captivity, no waiting for a formal decision.
They took the boys first.
Sigebert II, only a child, placed on the throne because of blood and politics, was executed almost immediately. Another young prince with him was killed too. And one infant, according to the sources, was spared, not out of mercy, but because even the Franks understood that killing a baby could create a different kind of backlash. Think about what that means. They didn't just remove Brunhild. They cut the future out from under her, fast, so no one could rally around the rightful heir later. And then they kept Brunhild alive long enough to make sure everyone watched her pay for it. That choice was intentional.
Because a dead queen is a problem.
But a living queen being publicly destroyed? That becomes a lesson that spreads. And the cruelest part is how she got there in the first place. Because Brunhild didn't lose to a stronger army in some heroic final battle. She lost to something colder, abandonment. The kind that happens when powerful men decide they'd rather survive under a new king than stand beside an old queen. As she marched to meet Clothair, key leaders quietly switched sides. Others simply walked away right before the fighting could begin. Her own forces refused to commit, like the ground dropped out from under her in real time. And in that moment, Brunhild realized the war wasn't ending because she was weak. It was ending because the people around her had decided she was expendable. But the next part is where it gets even darker, because one betrayal in particular didn't just hand her over. It handed Clothair the perfect excuse to call this slaughter law. The betrayal didn't start on the battlefield. It started in private, behind tents, behind closed doors, when powerful men began asking a single cold question. Who will still be standing when Clothair wins? Two officials in Brunhild's circle, men trusted to manage the realm, quietly opened a channel to Clothair. Not to negotiate peace, but to negotiate their own survival. And once that first deal was made, everything else collapsed faster than Brunhild could react. Because betrayal is contagious. As Brunhild marched to face Clothair's forces, key dukes and commanders began to peel away, one by one. Not after losing. Not after bloodshed. Before the battle even started. And that's the part that should chill you. Her army didn't get defeated. It simply refused to fight. Imagine it, your entire life has been power, command, authority, and then you look around and realize your power was never yours. It was rented. And the lease just expired. Brunhild ran, trying to protect the royal bloodline she'd built her entire strategy around. But the chase was relentless. And when Clothair caught them, he didn't just capture a rival. He captured a story he could weaponize. That's why the trial mattered so much. It was political theater, made to look like law. If he could label Brunhild as the root of all violence, then anything done to her, no matter how savage, would feel like righteousness to the crowd. And the crowd was ready. The soldiers had been told what to believe. The nobles needed a clean reset. Even the church, after years of conflict, had little reason to protect her. So when Brunhild stood there, surrounded by men who had already chosen their side, the verdict wasn't guilty. The verdict was, make an example so loud it echoes for generations. And in the next part, we're going to get into the most disturbing question of all. Why did they choose a punishment that wasn't just meant to kill her, but to make everyone watching feel complicit in her destruction? If you want to understand why Brunhild's death became so extreme, don't start with the torture. Start with the audience. Clothair didn't need her gone in secret. He needed thousands of men to see her reduced, so they'd never question him later. Because once soldiers laugh at a queen, once they spit at her, chant against her, watch her suffer, they can't pretend they were innocent. That's how a ruler locks loyalty in place, not with love, by making everyone share the stain. And Brunhild was the perfect target. Not because she was pure. She wasn't. She was a political survivor in a violent world. She ordered punishments. She made enemies. She played hard. But so did every man around her. The difference is, the story about her was written with a sharper knife. When a king crushed rivals, it was strength. When Brunhild did anything similar, it became unnatural. Wicked. Dangerous. So the spectacle wasn't just to punish her actions. It was to punish the idea that a woman could rule like a man, and still be allowed to live. And here's where the tension spikes, because the sources mention something that feels almost unreal. After the humiliation, after the accusations, after days designed to keep her alive, Clothair chose an ending that didn't just kill her, It made her body a battlefield. And in the next part, we're going to break down the execution method itself, why it was selected, what it symbolized, and why it horrified even people who were used to brutality. Here's why the horse mattered, because it wasn't just an execution tool. It was a symbol of force, speed, and control, and Brunhild was about to lose all three at once. They didn't choose a trained warhorse. Accounts describe an animal that was unbroken, wild enough to panic, strong enough to run, unpredictable enough to turn death into chaos. And then they tied her in a way that guaranteed one thing: she wouldn't come free quickly. Think about the psychology of that for a second.
A blade ends a life.
This method turns the ground into the weapon, and the crowd into witnesses. When the horse surged forward, the first snap would have felt like her body was being ripped out of itself. Then it becomes pure violence at speed. Rocks, roots, hard earth, every impact multiplying the damage. And because she'd already been tortured for days, her body wouldn't have had anything left to protect it. Here's the part most people don't expect: it likely wasn't instant.
Not clean.
Not merciful. Just motion and tearing, until there was finally nothing left that could fight to stay alive. And once it was over, Chlothar still had one fear: memory. Because if Brunhild's remains existed, people could shape the story differently later. So according to sources, they gathered what was left, and destroyed it in fire, so there would be no grave, no shrine, no place for sympathy to grow. But that raises a final, uncomfortable question: if this was truly justice, why did they work so hard to erase every trace? Quick check for perfect formatting: AAP chot hain total kidney parts han, e.g. 10-12, or harpart approximate kidney words/seconds? Here's the part that makes historians uneasy: we don't just inherit Brunhild's story, we inherit it from the people who won. Most surviving accounts were written under the shadow of the Merovingian court, where praising the victor wasn't optional, it was survival. So when Chlothar branded Brunhild as the cause of 10 royal deaths, that story didn't spread because it was proven. It spread because it was useful. And yes, Brunhild did make ruthless moves. In that world, mercy could get you killed. She punished nobles, crushed opposition, and fought like any ruler trying to keep control. But here's the twist: the same era that excused male kings for bloodshed turned Brunhild into a monster for playing the exact same game. So ask yourself this: if she was truly guilty of everything they claimed, why didn't they need evidence? Because the trial wasn't a courtroom. It was a stage. A public script where the crowd's reaction mattered more than the truth. And once the soldiers cheered, Chlothar got what he wanted: legitimacy bought with spectacle. But the most chilling clue that this was political, more than moral, comes from what happened right after her death. The kingdom didn't suddenly become peaceful because evil was defeated. It became quiet because the opposition bloodline was wiped out. And that leads to one last question, one that flips the entire story on its head. What if Brunhild wasn't executed because she was uniquely cruel, but because she was the last person alive who still threatened the new order? What happened after Brunhild died is the real proof this was never just revenge. Because the very same day her ashes disappeared, Chlothar didn't act like a man who'd avenged the kingdom. He acted like a man who just removed the final obstacle on a map. The civil wars that had chewed through generations suddenly had one clear winner.
One crown. One story.
And that story needed a villain. So Brunhild became the official explanation for decades of bloodshed, because blaming politics is messy, but blaming one woman is clean. It turns a tangled web of betrayals into a simple bedtime warning. See what happens when someone like her takes control? But here's the uncomfortable detail: if Brunhild was truly the source of chaos, then why did Chlothar also rush to eliminate the heirs beside her? Because legitimacy in the Frankish world wasn't just about who ruled today. It was about who could rule tomorrow. And the young kings tied to Brunhild's line were dangerous even as children, because one surviving boy could become a banner for rebellion 5 years later. That's why the sparing of the infant in the sources feels less like compassion, and more like calculation. Keeping one baby alive gave Chlothar a merciful image, while still smashing the line that mattered most. And once you see that, Brunhild's execution stops looking like punishment, and starts looking like a ritual meant to rewrite the future. But there's still one thing we haven't faced head-on, something that changes how you interpret her final silence. Was Brunhild truly powerless at the end? Or did she make one last choice that robbed her enemies of what they wanted most? What if Brunhild's last act of power was refusing to give them the one thing they wanted most?
Not her crown. Not her lands. Her submission.
The sources don't preserve a real defense from her. No long speech, no dramatic confession. And that absence is haunting, because Chlothar's entire spectacle depended on a final image: the wicked queen begging, breaking, validating the story they were selling. But if she stayed silent, or refused to perform for them, then even while chained, she denied them control of the narrative in the only way she still could. That's why the execution wasn't just violent. It was excessive. It's what you do when you're not only eliminating a rival. You're trying to crush the idea that the rival ever mattered. And yet, it didn't work. Because 1,400 years later, we still say her name. We still argue about whether she was a ruthless operator in a ruthless era, or a convenient scapegoat punished more brutally because she was a woman who wouldn't step aside. So here's the question I want to leave you with, because it changes how you see everything. If Brunhild had been a man with the same political record, would history even call her a monster? In the next part, I'll tie the entire story together with the one detail that reveals what this execution was really built to protect, and who truly benefited from turning her death into legend. The detail that exposes the real purpose of Brunhild's execution isn't on the battlefield. It's what happened immediately after the ashes cooled. Clotaire didn't just win.
He stabilized, fast.
He moved like a man who'd been waiting for one final obstacle to disappear, and suddenly the doors of power swung open. The nobles who'd resisted Brunhild?
They fell in line.
The church that had turned on her?
It stopped fighting.
The kingdom that had been tearing itself apart for decades went quiet. Not because everyone forgave each other. Because everyone got a deal.
And Brunhild was the price.
Within a year, Clotaire positioned himself as the restorer of order, backed by the exact power blocks that hated Brunhild's iron rule. Think about that for a second. If her death was purely moral justice, why did it instantly function like a political settlement? Because Brunhild represented something bigger than her personality. She represented central authority, a crown strong enough to punish nobles, control appointments, and command loyalty. And the aristocracy didn't fear her because she was old. They feared her because she proved a terrifying truth: the throne could still bite back. So the spectacle, the trial, the humiliation, the 3-day torment, the horse, wasn't only to punish Brunhild. It was to announce a new contract to the realm. The old way is over. The queen who challenged you is gone. Now support me. But here's the last twist, the one that flips the story from monster to threat. What if Brunhild wasn't executed because she destroyed the kingdom, but because she was strong enough to reshape it, and too many powerful men preferred it broken and controllable? But what if the most unbelievable part of Brunhild's death is that the brutality may have been designed to be remembered, even exaggerated, so nobody would ever dare challenge the new order again? Because almost everything we know about her final days comes through hostile voices, chronicles written in a world where the winner's version became the official version. And when you read those accounts, you can feel the intent: turn her into a cautionary tale so complete that sympathy becomes dangerous. Still, the core pattern repeats across sources: public condemnation, ritual humiliation, prolonged suffering, and then the horse. Whether every detail was recorded perfectly or sharpened for effect, the message stays the same. They didn't want a quiet death. They wanted a spectacle that would outlive the woman.
And it did.
Brunhild didn't just lose power. She became a symbol, either of ruthless ambition or of a system terrified of a woman who could rule. And that's why her story still hits so hard. It forces you to ask whether justice is sometimes just a word powerful people use when they're cleaning the board. So when you hear the title, Frankish soldiers executed Queen Brunhild, the real question isn't only how. It's who benefited from the world believing she deserved it. Because once you follow that thread, you'll realize Brunhild wasn't the only woman whose name was turned into a weapon in this dynasty. There's another one, older, dead, and still pulling strings through hatred and revenge. And if we unpack her role, the entire saga shifts into something even darker. If Brunhild's story feels like it's driven by pure hatred, it's because it was. Long before Clotaire II ever faced her, there was another name whispered like a curse in Merovingian courts: Fredegund, Clotaire's mother. And this is where the timeline turns from politics into a blood feud that lasted decades. Brunhild's husband, King Sigebert, was assassinated in 575, stabbed by killers tied to Fredegund's side. That single murder didn't just end a king.
It lit a fuse.
Brunhild didn't forget.
She couldn't.
In that world, grief and strategy were the same thing. So when Clotaire later accused Brunhild of killing kings, there was an unspoken subtext the army didn't need explained.
This is payback.
This is the old war finally ending. And that's what made her so easy to demonize. By the time she was captured, people weren't judging one woman's actions anymore. They were settling a generational score. Every rumor stuck. Every accusation felt true enough. And every soldier watching her suffer felt like they were avenging ghosts. But here's the part that should make you pause. If Clothair's rise depended on painting Brunhild as the ultimate villain, then the most important weapon wasn't the horse. It was the story told afterward. Because once you control the story, you control what the next generation believes about power, about queens, and about who deserves mercy. And in the final stretch, there's one last question we have to answer. One that decides how you interpret everything you just watched unfold. Was Brunhild destroyed for her crimes? Or for what she threatened to become if she lived one more year?